It's really a pleasure to introduce Hassan Mahamdallie. He was once a journalist on Socialist Worker. He's a playwright and really excellent plays, and a writer, amongst lots of other things. He's also involved in the movement for cultural democracy, and he's going to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we have somebody else as well who's going to speak brilliantly too. After that, there'll be lots of time for discussion. So go ahead, Hass.
I'm going to stand up and do this so I'm visible. It's always important. What I want to do, basically what myself and Nick are going to do, I think, is kind of lay out a perspective and an argument, and then open it up to you to really to fill in the conversation. And the first thing is just to say what this talk is not about, or this session is not about. It's not about sort of the debates between high art and popular art and all those kind of things. It's not whether it was right that C.R. James's favourite author was Thackeray. We're not going to debate anything like that. What I'm going to do to begin with is lay out a kind of perspective, post-World War II perspective up to the present day, on the relationship between, if you like, class, cultural production, and the kind of situation which we face at the moment as cultural workers who come from the working class, or are interested in the working class and their relation to cultural production and art. That's really, and then we're open up to you. And this question of democracy is obviously very key to that. So I'm going to start actually with the 1930s, because one of the kind of lies or assumptions that are made is that there's never really been a working class culture or working class art in this country, and that really there's such a thing as a creative class, which is really, if you look at it, and I'm going to go through this, is those at the higher echelons of that creative class reflect class society in general, and that really working class people aren't interested in culture and they're not really interested in the arts. So I'm going to start in the 1930s, and the fact that through the 1930s and through the 1940s into the 1950s, there were clearly mass artistic and cultural movements that working class people took part in, just to kind of prove that we are interested as working class people in the arts. And that movement was the dance hall movement. Now, every town, city, village had dance halls. In 1930s, those dance halls or ballrooms were professionally run. They attracted the best jazz and big band orchestras, and you went there 2 or 3 times a week and you learnt how to the dance moves, the dances to go along with that, and you enjoyed yourself. And it was a mass movement in the sense that if you're working class, maybe you would go to the dance halls 2 or 3 times a week, and they were packed. Absolutely packed, and that movement grew and grew and grew. And I'll just give you an idea about who took part in that dance hall movement. And this is a quote. The manager of a dance hall in Bolton, Lancashire, reported that his clientele was steel workers, lots of mill girls and men, textile workers, machinists, cloth, rayon people, plumbers, joiners, de Havilland workers, talking about during World War II, building traders, office workers. And if you're old enough, you remember there was a network of ballrooms owned by the Mecca ballrooms. And they had a very low entrance fee of 6pence. And they encouraged, clearly, a kind of cultural egalitarianism. So another quote, and this is from actually a Mecca ballroom manager. In a dance hall, there's no differentiation between patrons. They're all on the same floor level. All pay the same price of admission. There's no class distinction whatsoever. Complete freedom of speech for all and sundry. There were 2,000 of these dance halls all through the UK by 1938. In 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, the Royal Opera House decided it would close because it was afraid that the German Luftwaffe were going to bomb the Royal Opera House. It closed business for the whole of the war, and instead Mecca took it over and turned the Royal Opera House into a ballroom. And in that ballroom, it entertained 1,500 dancers every night, all through the Blitz, all through the whole of World War II. At the end of World War II, the Royal Opera House took it back and started business again. And interestingly enough, when you talk about post World War II, if you like, part of the big drive in terms of public provision was also, for the first time in this country, the notion that the arts should be subsidised by the state in some way. And John Maynard Keynes, the economist, he took one of the organisations which had been going around towns and villages during World War II, entertaining people as a kind of a patriotic act to get people to forget about the war for a moment and enjoy themselves in some music or go and see some art or theatre or whatever it might be, or music hall. He took one of those organisations and he turned it into the Arts Council of Great Britain, which then became Arts Council England, Arts Council Wales, and then later Creative Scotland. And he made sure, because he is an opera buff, he made sure that the Royal Opera House was taken away from Mecca and returned to the grandees of the Royal Opera House. And his whole thing about the Arts Council at the beginning, which is public subsidy for the first time really in terms of the arts, that money should be put into what he called the fine arts. In other words, you might call it the high arts, opera, ballet, those kind of things. Not which I've got anything against, of course, but this is what he decided. That's what that money should be spent on. And he got some money out of the treasury, and basically that was the beginnings of the Arts Council. And what he wanted was that really his idea was a very sort of patrician idea. In in terms of the BBC, that really the middle classes really should hold the reins of cultural production, that the working classes should be educated into these fine and high and traditional arts. And if there's anything left, it could go to, the plebeian artists, as it were. So, for example, Joan Littlewood, who started the Theatre Royal Stratford East as a very egalitarian, communist-influenced theatre workshop, there's stories about how she was turned down for Arts Council funding. So if anyone's applied for Arts Council funding and never got it turned down, don't worry, you're in good company. She got turned down again and again and again. She used to go to the Arts Council, wait in the corridor to wait to see the big grandee, the boss in charge of the Arts Council, for like 4 hours on the end, and being Joan Littlewood, she'd storm out swearing and screaming, and that'd be the end of that. Eventually they got a little bit of money to get going. But actually, if you think about it, Joan Littlewood and Theatre Workshop in Theatre Royal Stratford East in the East End of London, not far from here, right, in one sense laid the foundations for British theatre in post-war in terms of form, content, the way that she took popular forms like music hall, Oh What a Lovely War. Her influence was absolutely massive. In actual fact, she got so pissed off actually with the Arts Council and subsidised art systems. She actually emigrated to France and lived in Paris for the rest of her life. So really, that kind of set the trend really in terms of the arts in this country. That really it was the heritage and responsibility of the upper middle classes, and they were the people who had the reins of cultural production. That's not to say that other movements didn't come from below. A lot of movements came from below. So, for example, in 1968, the whole revolutionary wave around 1968 ushered in a whole wave of very radical art, theatre, music, dance, all sorts of things. Theatre in schools, community theatre. These are the things that I worked in when I first went into the arts in the 1980s. But really, privilege still remained very much the guiding tenet. And not only that, if you like, organisations like the Arts Council and critics and those people were really the tastemakers. They decided what art was real art, what art was not so good, which art stood at the top, ballet, opera, which art was at the bottom, community art, amateur arts, which was a massive movement in and of itself, to be honest. And therefore those priorities dictated where the money should go. So I just want to talk, before I hand over to Nick, about what the situation is now. And it's very, very interesting. And if you're interested in this, you should look up Panic, It's an Arts Emergency. Panic, Social Class, Taste and Inequalities in the Creative Industries. It's a paper that came out, a research paper that came out last year. And basically it looked at various data sets to look at the kind of class composition in the arts at the moment. And it came up with some very interesting conclusions. Those at the top of the arts tree, if you like, the tastemakers, the people in charge of the means of cultural production in that sense, were predominantly upper middle class. They consider themselves to be a class apart. They consider themselves to have, if you like, the best idea of what art should be and what art is, and so on and so forth. So, you know, they really are internal tastemakers, if you like. Those who, as you go up the ladder, because the arts in this country is structured very hierarchically, those who earn more than £50,000 a year believe that they got there through their own talent and skill, rather than the fact that they went to public school or they went to Oxbridge University and so on and so forth. They believe that somehow they are imbued with talent, and that's what's actually risen to the top, rather than the fact of their networks, which are basically class networks, which get them into those high positions. So the further up the ladder and the further salaries that you earn, the more you believe this. And therefore, when it comes to people who are working class, implicitly they believe, well, to be honest, talent will out. You know, talent will out. There's not really anything to stop people. The arts is very liberal. And therefore, if you have talent, you'll get to the top. Now, anyone actually who's at the bottom knows it's not really to do with talent at all. It's to do with class. It's to do with networks. It's to do with who you know. I mean, 70% of the jobs in the creative industries are doled out on the basis of basically closed networks, as opposed to, you know, who applies for the job. Anyone who works in the arts knows this to be the case. And just next slide, please, if you can. Now, you can't probably see this, but this shows how class composition has been concentrated in the hands of this upper middle class layer. So in 1981, when I first started theatre training, let me get the figures. In 1981, more working class people were going into the arts than upper middle class people. And I think, to be honest, that was a kind of the final drive of that radical theatre movement, where actually working class people thought that they could have a career in the arts and could practice their arts. So I kind of came in on that wave, I think, in the early 1980s. So more working class people came into the arts during that period of the 1980s. Today, it's completely opposite. So more upper middle class kids go into the arts than working class kids. And if you look at the trends, you can see that despite all the kind of rhetoric around equality and diversity and whatever, which is the kind of field that I work in, despite all that rhetoric, the concentration of if you like, the upper middle classes have a firmer grip on the arts than they have since World War II. Now, why does this matter? And I'll end on this. Of course, it matters in terms of representation and just basic equality. You know, if you're a working class kid and you want to go into the theatre or you want to go into music, then why should you not? Should it be your social background or your parents' economic situation? Should that stop you? Absolutely not. Particularly when you're talking about the arts being subsidised. the notion that actually this is money drawn from general taxation, then why? Yes, of course, it's a question of representation. But finally, I'd like to argue, and then hand over to Nick, that it's more than that. In actual fact, in one sense, the arts is about, or should be about the imagination. It should be about rehearsing possibilities. I mean, I call theatre, my particular trade, the playground for dangerous ideas. The notion that within theatre, and I think it's the same but in different ways, manifestations in all art forms, in one sense, it's a kind of arena where possibilities for the future, lessons from the past, voices which need to be heard, voices which have particular truths, can gather, and an audience then gathers around them, and you kind of have that debate. That's what I see theatre as. It might be a debate through ideas by characters or by circumstances. It's always about contradictions. As Marxists, we kind of understand that. That's what the arts is all about. So to me, it's more than representation. It's also about the fact that if the working class don't have those cultural artistic arenas, those imaginative arenas by which their concerns, their view of the world, their interests, the contradictions in their lives are played out, then in one sense that's an integral part, if you like, of working class life and politicised working class movement, which we're being blocked out of. So it's more than just representation. Just to end on this, it does make a difference in terms of what kind of culture and arts we receive. I mean, I've got nothing against, was it Phoebe Bridgewaller, right? Nothing against her at all. I watched Killing Eve. I found that quite good. I've never watched Fleabag, but I did notice, and funny enough, she came out with this argument last week. She said, look, the reason that I'm successful is basically because I tried really, really hard. And they all say that. And it's not because I've got aristocracy on both sides of my family. That's got absolutely nothing to do with it. And then I have not watched Fleabag, and you can tell me if any of you have watched Fleabag. But I was looking at, you watched it. It's brilliant. But I was looking at it in terms of the casting for Fleabag, and I noticed that, as far as I could tell, there are two black or minority characters in it. One is played by Ray Fearon. Is that right? Who's apparently some kind of how do you describe his character? Peripheral. Okay, that's good. But he's a kind of not untrustworthy man. Am I right? Kind of thing, or a bit of a flyboy or something. Bit of a flyboy. And then there's one other character who I can tell has probably a Greek Cypriot extraction. One actor of Greek Cypriot who plays a kind of similar figure, a kind of peripheral flyboy figure. This is according to Wikipedia. I've never watched it. And therefore you think, okay, so what might possibly be wrong with that? And of course, it's a notion of how, if you like, working class or minority characters are portrayed, even in these wonderful vehicles such as Fleabag. So it does make a difference because the world is being reinterpreted, by these people, and then being delivered to us on Netflix or on our TVs or even in live performance. And for me, that's an injustice, and we need to change that. I've been fighting for 35 years in that change. It's a big struggle, but to be honest, it's worth it because actually I think the cultural and the artistic arena are an important arena for class warfare. The upper working class know it's about class, trust me, and they're very well organised. We, working class people, need to understand also that that class is played out in terms of arts and culture, and we need to begin to take back, if you like, the means of production.
Thank you very much, Hassan. Right, I'm now going to introduce Nick Mahoney, who is a researcher, co-chair of the Raymond Williams Foundation and the co-founder of the Movement for Cultural Democracy. Off you go.
Thank you. I'm going to talk very briefly, simply to introduce this project we've been working on now for a little while. The Movement for Cultural Democracy is an initiative that looks to connect with and build out from some of the historical currents that Hassan's been mentioning, but there's also things that are going on in contemporary culture concerned with how culture is understood, how it's produced, how it's changed, And by culture, we're thinking here very broadly, everything from everyday culture, the cultures we live in every day, to big P political forms of culture, culture in the arts broadly defined. Historically, and Hassan's already mentioned a lot of this, there's a long tradition of work on the left about the cultural material basis of inequality and domination. You've heard of intellectuals like William Morris, obviously, and Tawney and Raymond Williams, George Padmore, Paul Gilroy, there's lots of people. There's also, just as importantly, many seams of practice-based work through the 20th century and before and since, undertaken by radical working class people, black and people, women's self-education movements, grassroots cultural groups, DIY community arts collectives, underground music scenes, writing scenes, a whole range of other kinds of non-elite cultural activity. And together this has always demonstrated the value of non-elite forms of culture and non-elite cultures of political collectivity and action. Raymond Williams, who I talk about a lot, he said culture is one of the most complex words in the English language. It's sort of a beguiling word. You know, he talks about culture being ordinary, and then he goes on to write, quite a long series of books about how complicated it is, as well as being very ordinary. And I think one of the most useful rubrics he has in terms of thinking about culture is that he talks about the simultaneity, if you like, of dominant forms of culture, which is in our case now, neoliberal forms of culture, the sorts of forms of gentrification we see around us, the sorts of forms of culture that dominate the culture industries. But then he says, running in parallel to that, there's always residual traditions of culture, so much more long-standing traditions, whether they're religious cultures or working class cultures or institutional cultures that have survived through the bits of the welfare state that have survived. But then he says the third type of culture is always useful to think about in parallel to the dominant and the residual is the emergent, and that's the new forms of culture that are breaking out all over the place. And in his time, that was the new social movements, women's movement, environmental movement, and there's other forms of culture breaking out all the time and at the moment. So that's how he would, in a sense, conceptualise cultural struggle. All these types of culture going on at the same time. All of them are trying to incorporate the other all the time. So the neoliberal culture is always trying to incorporate the emergent forms of new culture that are coming out in resistance to neoliberal culture. The traditional forms of culture are trying to survive and sometimes incorporate them too. So these struggles over how contemporary culture is understood, how it changes, and how cultures change over time play out today in all sorts of ways. And this movement for cultural democracy first emerged following a set of discussions about some of these issues that was organised as part of the World Transformed Festival back in 2017 in Brighton. So it was in this context, in 2017, that a group of people, including filmmaker Ashish Gadgali, cultural producer Lois Stanek, Hassan here, Labour MEP Julie Ward, artists such as Peter Kennard, representatives of a group called Brandalism. There was a community organiser who was involved called Musa Amin Silla from the Selby Centre in Tottenham. Myself and a number of others came together, and about 150 people came along to these sessions that we ran about injustices in the cultural sector. But then it also was more wide-ranging than that. We talked a bit about the shortcomings of Labour Party's cultural policy as it was laid out in the 2017 Labour Party manifesto, and how that kind of, in a sense, just reproduced this sort of culture industries model that was has dominated for the last 20 more than 20 years. We also talked a bit about issues that people had with cultures of left organising at the time, but people really were keen to generate some new ideas and ways of working together too. So since then, this movement for cultural democracy, there's about 200 people sort of signed up, and please, there's the websites up there, and do sign up and get involved if you're interested in these issues. It's run further events around the country on issues such as class, urban regeneration. We've set up short campaigns to highlight some of the limitations of the cultural industry model, if you like, including policies of Arts Council England. We produced a paper about the injustices of the cultural funding system. you'll all know about the National Lottery, and that wasn't originally set up to fund the arts, but now it does fund a lot of the arts in this country, in England especially. And obviously money is generated from a lot of the poorest people in society, and a lot of that money then is cross-subsidises arts and cultural activities that's not used by those people basically, and is used by richer people in society. So I think there's a lot of campaigning to do around how arts funding that is available is distributed, and we're calling for arts funding to be devolved to local level, and that lottery funding especially should be given disproportionately back to the people that actually pay for it, to subsidise cultural production at community level. Members from the movement have been part of forging a new group called Creative Commons Cardiff to resist the ongoing march of gentrification there. And then one of the things that came out of the original session at World Transformed and has been developed since is a manifesto for cultural democracy, which helps to crystallise the sort of changes where the people that have been involved are looking to work towards. So I'll finish in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to just read out a few excerpts from the manifesto to give you a sense of the range of things that people that have got involved have been calling for, and what the sort of things we want to campaign on more, if you like. And the cultural democracy idea is quite broad. It's not specifically always to do with the arts as we as we sort of conventionally are told it exists. So one of the first demands is, as I said, is for the radical redistribution of funding for arts and cultural activities. But more than that, people who have been involved have really passionately believe that decisions about which cultural activities are supported and funded by the state should be made at a much more local level. So yeah, I won't talk any more about that. So yeah, even the Arts Council used to have local officials at local government level, and those are all gone now. So that kind of accountability and responsiveness to local people has disappeared, and the decisions are made much more centrally now. We would like cultural decision making to be much more transparent and accountable. Investment in people and process over product and results. We're also calling for a levy of 1% of profits from the big cultural players to be invested more democratically, as described in the earlier items, if you like. Cultural sector must pay its taxes in full. Cultural activities should benefit everyone. And in order to support the development of truly grassroots and more democratic forms of culture. We also believe, this is more kind of detailed if you like, but the councils, the arts councils' charters should need to be redrafted to reflect much broader societal goals. And then there's a really important point to make about public space as well, because public space has obviously been subject to a lot of privatisation in recent years. And so the public spaces need to be reinvested in and put in the service of public-led forms of cultural production. And there's a lot of stuff came up about housing and gentrification and social cleansing as well in these discussions. And so that's another... And the cultural industries, as you may well see when you go around London and elsewhere, is very complicit now, the cultural industry, in gentrification processes. So lots of spaces, before they're softened up for redevelopment, they're offered to artists at small rents, but only on a very short-term basis, to bring so-called new people in, middle-class people in to the area to sort of raise the land value, and then those artists are chucked out, and then the new luxury flats are put up. So the way that artists and cultural sector are involved in these processes needs to be much more closely scrutinised. End sponsorship of the arts by unethical corporate interests. Cultural workers need to be guaranteed a living wage, because many of them are freelance workers, and it's often their conditions are often really poor. And then there's a lot was discussed about arts education, arts and cultural education, which has also been really rolled back in the last 15, 20 years especially. So lifelong cultural and creative learning needs to be free at the point of use. Yeah, and that's basically it. So overall, the belief is that our cultural lives in a cultural democracy if we had some of these policies and some of these ideas realised, we'd be closer to a cultural democracy, which could unlock lots of positive social values and bring benefits of creativity, community and joy into more of our aspects of our democratic life. I'll stop there. Thank you.
There is my lovely assistant here is going to go around with a microphone.
Hello, I'm Jonathan from West London. I don't think that example you've given about dance halls is truly representative of the mass participation in social activities and enjoyment. Through the 1930s, there was an organisation that was funded by the Central Office of Information called the Mass Observation Society. And what they did is they asked people what they did in their spare time, their activities outside of work. And they got pretty good an idea of how people spent their time before television, etc. Now, a number of filmmakers come to mind. I don't know if you've heard of Humphrey Jennings. He, through the Mass Observation Society, he made a lot of groundbreaking films for ordinary people about what they did in their spare time. Humphrey Jennings is very much an overlooked documentary director that made Listen to Britain's Spare Time just about before the Second World War, about people, what they did in their spare time in the mining communities. He made a film about people, brass bands, and he made a film about how people conceptualized art as well. What they thought about art. There are other filmmakers, Edgar Anstey, John Grierson, that put images of countries, Africa, the British Empire Marketing Board, and the Empire Marketing Unit, where travel wasn't as cheap and comfortable as it is now. At that time, it was out of the grasp of the ordinary people to travel to far-flung places, Africa, America, and he gave the mass of people an idea of the cultures and practices of these countries, folklores of these countries, and Flaherty as well. We must give credit to the Central Office of Information, the Mass Observation Society, that did work positively to give people an idea for their leisure, for their recreation, more to improve their outlook on the world, especially with the poor educated, with those that weren't able to educate themselves before the Secondary School Act of the 1960s, and education wasn't available for the masses. These people actually.
Can you sum up, please, Conrad?
Well, I think the dance halls is a really poor example of how the mass of ordinary people got to enlighten,
sum up, please.
Just enlighten their own minds by the direction of the Empire Marketing Board, Humphrey Jennings, and the Mass Observation Society.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike Byrne from Coventry, member of SWP. Show my age a little bit. When I was working in the factories, I left school at 15 and went straight in the factory and stuff. But I do remember sort of, we didn't call it culture, but we used to have our own societies and stuff. And everyone had different things, different skills and abilities. We had like chess clubs, and we had a drama club as well. So we used to have like, people used to join the acting club and the drama club, and they'd put on productions in the big hall there at Christmas and stuff, pantomime and stuff like that. And and also singers, and there was some. I remember hearing some singers singing some old ballads, and Scottish people would be there. Because when I was back in Coventry, it was an immigrant city, and my dad was Irish, and everyone was Irish, Scottish, and people were coming down from communities, Caribbean, everything. and they all together and we all sang and stuff and that sort of stuff. And also when I used to go to the social club, the working men's club, social club, and Saturday night they'd have a singer coming on and singing, and the comedians and whatever. And there was like lots of opportunities to do things. And I also remember that I never went to the theatre until I was, I think, 35 when I met my missus, and she was like a school teacher, and I always thought the theatre was nothing that for us we could go to. I always remember when the first time it was a civic theatre, and that was post-war, so that was meant to be for the community. But I remember going there, it was all full of middle-class people, and going there and feeling so nervous and out of my comfort zone. That was really weird. And looking back at it now, I think, geez, why should I be like that? I'm paying my taxes for this bleeding place. Why should it just be for the middle classes? You know, why can't I enjoy it? Because I'm paying for it. I'm paying for it. And I've got to be honest with you, I left school and didn't learn sod all, but they put us in a factory. But the biggest thing for me, and I've got to say, I got a lot of time for the BBC, and I really I loathe the way this government taxes the BBC and stuff, because like it was Radio 4, because I was lucky because my mum had Radio 4 on when we were kids. We were in a council station, she also had Radio 4, and so these different things would come on, and it struck my mind, and also libraries. So they're so fantastic, and anything to do with the community should be encouraged. And also one last thing, I love that programme Shameless, because it's got nothing to do with council people. We didn't live like that. We were decent people, hard-working, and programmes like that really pissed me off big time.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I didn't miss some of the start of it, but it seemed really interesting. And just going on from what you were saying about it being a class issue, like I really agree, because I studied theatre, and I was just lucky I got into uni through a rural scholarship. I'm from rural Queensland, but actually it was like really from where I'm from, no one was really encouraged to be creative because it's a really poor area, and everyone's like, well, you've got to get into a sensible career, you know, shouldn't you be a teacher or something? And I actually started studying to be a teacher, and then I was like, I hated it so much, I really wanted to get into to drama. My school actually cut drama completely because we couldn't afford a drama teacher at the school, so I nearly didn't even get into it at uni. But then you see all these people who've gone private, I don't know if they're called private schools here, but they were private school educated, and all of them from quite well-off backgrounds. And funnily enough, it's the ones who are from the well-off backgrounds who are then well-connected in the industry and then have an easier time of making it. And that's one thing that really drove me to politics, actually, because I was trying to be a comedian and trying to get into Edinburgh Festival, and everyone's like, Edinburgh Festival's amazing, you should go there, it's for new and upcoming artists. I'm like, okay, great. But then you go there, actually it's for new and upcoming artists who have money, are able to actually put all that energy and work into it and pay. The free venues are not free. You have to pay. And I was just, they double the price of accommodation during the whole month. And so actually it's not accessible. I love Edinburgh Festival, but it's not an accessible festival for a lot of working class people because we just couldn't afford it. And it's this idea that the rich are the only ones who have the time and the money to enjoy art and culture. The rest of us should just work and we should just be grateful for any art that we get. And actually, I think it's an essential part of learning, an essential part of life. Everyone's creative. It's not true there's just creative types. Everyone's creative. It's just if you get the opportunity to be. And that's why I'm a socialist as well. I'm a socialist as well because that really just drove me to really hate capitalism, because I'm like, this should not be a thing that's about profit. It should be a thing that's about everyone just enjoying art, enjoying performing, enjoying all these things as a community, and not just it being for the rich and for the rich to entertain each other, because even the rich are the ones who are able to perform now as well. That's really what drove me to be a socialist, because I just got so angry at that, and I think that absolutely needs to change.
Hi, Chris Tavener, and like Jasmine, I'm a stand-up comedian. You might have seen both of us the other day smashing it, you know what I mean? I'll lead on. Completely agree with everything Jasmine said about the sort of like the financial side. I'm taking a show up to the Edinburgh Festival this year, and I'm doing it as cheap as humanly possible, and it will still cost thousands of pounds. Even the ones who are in there, if anyone's gone up to festival, you see people with these huge posters and are in the big venues, they are still making a massive loss. The only people who make money in Edinburgh are those who run the venues. That is it. and the publicists and the people printing the posters and everything else. And those of you who are at the top end, even your big names will still make a loss, but it's an investment, so they can do their time, etc., and they'll make money elsewhere. That is not true for a lot of people. And it's an interesting discussion, sort of like Hassan said about Phoebe Waller-Bridge, saying that she got there through hard work. Now, I will sort of say twofold, and I agree with Hassan. Obviously, one thing I'll say in her defence is I'm sure she's absolutely right that she's put hard work in it. If you get to the top doing anything cultural, whether that's writing, directing, acting, whatever, it takes hard work, no matter what your financial background. However, has she taken into account how much harder work it is for people who do not have her financial background? Probably not, because they don't get to be a success, and you don't get to hear all the failures. You don't hear those stories there because they're not there to tell their story. And it does bring on an issue there. This is an interesting thing when we're talking about putting cultural stuff out there. Getting people involved, working class people involved with cultural output, and also producing it for a working class audience, and that comes down to money. Because if you're producing it, you need to get paid. And if you want to go and watch it, you have to pay. And this is the difficulty we've got, and it does cut people off. If you're a stand-up comedian, I'll say to anyone who, if they want to do stuff on the circuit, you need to be able to do comedy that is suitable for, frankly, sort of a middle-aged, veering towards middle-class crowd. I've recently got married, bought a house. I've got that material. It's fine. I can do the mainstream. Don't think I can't. But that is the thing. Younger people, younger working class people, they can't afford. You know, your comedy club might be like 15, 20 quid to get in. It's all money that people are paying for an entire pass for a day of stuff here at Marxism. So that is something to take into account. But at the same time, I will also urge people in organisations when we're trying to put on cultural events and political events, if you're doing music, comedy, anything like that, do try and take into account, you do need to try and pay the people you're bringing in, because we're not just giving off free time. If it's an evening, that's actually us giving up work to come and do that. If you set your events up properly, you get to pay us and then keep the money there that goes towards the good cause. And we will always be. And by the way, I am not expensive. If you do need me for anything, thank you. Cheers.
Well done for keeping to time. This comrade at the front here.
Hello, my name is Robert Bunton. I'm a co-founder of Poets Against Racism. There's a couple of points I want to raise. It's, first of all, if you're working with grassroots people, it's not about money, it's about creating a space and a place for people to actually explore their creativity, and also to put their issues through politics, through their creativity, whether that be poetry, song, dance, or anything else. And the other issue I want to talk about is, you talk about the working class and the upper class. I kind of like to see myself more as an underclass performer, because it's about having I'm an activist artist, and it's really, as a disabled person, it's about finding the platforms to be able to perform. And I mean this both in the environmental way, because most places are not wheelchair accessible or accessible to disabled people, but there's also the attitudinal thing that people have about some people that actually, how can you be creative and a crib? Because it's about how you overcome people's attitudes about how they see you as a performer, and how you break through that barrier of people's attitudes about people who are different.
Yeah, I want to start. I mean, when I left school, 15, I mean, the place where I really, really began to learn performance and how I learned to move in a kind of a theatre situation where you put on different personas within that space, where I actually learned the lyrics and the words of song that gave me great enjoyment and hope was at the Mecca Dance Hall in Tottenham, at the Royal, and also at the Palace in Ilford, and at the down in Stockwell. Stockwell's a bit dodgy because we got chased out of there by the local lads, but nevertheless, I think it's completely wrong, the kind of not understanding that I don't think I was observed by a documentary filmmaker with a camera in my habitat, which is really what that kind of first contribution was about the arts, is that the way that the working class are looked at is not, and I think it's more interesting about how do the ordinary people get representation and an expression for what they want to do. I agree with what an earlier speaker was saying about the desire to create is a human desire, it's a human attribute. It is about our very being, and to be blocked from doing that is causes all kinds of serious fuck-ups in terms of alienation and in terms of not being able to really get it over. People express themselves in all kinds of ways, whether it's their allotment, a window box, the way they dress. There's all kinds of ways that human beings try to possess it. But also there's the other form. And the other thing that I want to say is the reason why I think that graph changed in the middle 1980s is because that was the victory over the creative arts of postmodernity. That was the time when they said that the Enlightenment project is over. We can no longer talk about art as cognition. We can only talk about art as almost anything. Anything goes kind of idea. And that it is not social conditioning that determines what the art is or what it's going to look like, but the psychology of the individual. So it's no wonder that kind of art as a plaything or art as just an expression of almost anything becomes the area in the city where the new middle classes adopt an art form and a creativity which is really reflects their lifestyle their lifestyle aspirations in the village, in the city, and the city where they conquer it with their money and with their gentrification becomes their plaything. The amount of people who see the city becomes a plaything, and so does the art and culture of that. Yeah, we're going to sum up now. What I think we need funding and we need space. That is what we need.
Great stuff.
So just number one, I just think everyone should read Raymond Williams' Keywords if you haven't, which is I think where you were talking a lot about culture. But before I sort of kind of transferred to working in the NHS as a healthcare professional, I worked as an audio producer, and I can truly concur with what Jasmine and Chris were saying, that being an actor or being any kind of person in the creative arts is hard, and that anyone who says I've worked hard, they all work hard. None of them, no one who is unsuccessful, successful, did it for 2 months, done it for 10 years, none of them are just lazing around. But I just wanted to come back to the idea of lazing around, and I think the space to think and space to create, as Roger and Robert were talking about, is something that is sorely not available anymore. If you read back, I was reading Kate Bush's autobiography, at some point, whatever her record label was, gave her a bunch of money and said, go away for 3 years and have a think. Come back to us when you've got something. And that is something that kind of used to happen. Okay, Kate Bush isn't exactly the poorest person in the world, but to have enough money to do nothing, to live on a shoestring, to not even take things to Edinburgh, that costs. You at least need to be able to pay your rent, you at least need to be able to eat. You need to, and that is, I guess, and I don't use this term often, but that is a privilege not afforded to the working class, because by nature we work and we have to work. And I think that's why I really support the call for extra funding, because we actually need to give young people, old people, anyone who wants to be creative, some actual space to think and be creative and be at least relatively comfortable, because I don't know where the myth came from that you have to be starving and in pain to create great art. I think we've got a lot of art from people who are in pain. Let's have some art from people who aren't in pain and see what we come up with. And by the way, I wasn't allowed to go to art college, so a massive chip on my shoulder.
I was fortunate to go to art college, basically because my best mate, FE, was basically going to art college, and I thought, oh, that would be a year off before I have to go nursing, you know. So I went with her. But when I got in and started to understand what art was about, it was absolutely incredible. It was amazing. But then again, I didn't have enough money for like loads of paints and all that sort of stuff. So I was going around, warehouses and building sites looking to do abstract stuff with rubbish, you know. And so I went into this tiny, dirty little workshop. Well, I was asking the workers, you know, have you got any nuts and bolts or anything that I can use in that? And so he looked at me a bit quizzically at first and then said, look for the gaffer, and went, come in, and took me to a little horrible workshop at the back, really dark. And he pulled back a curtain, and because I was saying I wanted to do something with nuts and bolts or wood or whatever, he says, what you mean like this? And he pulled from underneath this horse made of the tiniest bolts. But the thing about the horse, it wasn't twee. It was about freedom. And you can imagine, you know, you're talking about art expressing something. That was his, you know, day in, day out, doing the same sort of thing. When the gaffer wasn't there, he was, you know, making something, he was saying something about what his aspirations were. And I thought, oh, shit, I'll give up now, you know. But I carried on, and I did get a good grade. I'm not showing off, but the point is that when you left college, could you afford a studio? Well, no, you couldn't. So we did. A few of us got together, and we decided that we'd try to, you know, with thinking about art and class and all this sort of stuff. So we got together, and we thought we'd get together and do a film co-op together. But we had to get money from Southern Arts, which you could get money then. So Southern Arts said, well, we're not going to give you anything. Go back to the council. Whatever the council gives you, we'll match it. So we went to the council. They said the same thing. So we went back to Southern Arts and said, the council's given us £12,000. Will you match it? So we got £24,000. And we bought this big, you know, with another theatre company. And we were going into the community, teaching, you know, how to make film to working class mothers that were stuck with the kids in the, you know, in the council estate, to disabled groups, to working class people, showing them not just so you can see films which were really useful for them, that were made by other, other sort of socially, about political films, but also they were able to make those films as well. 3 years down the line, this funding was cut by, Southern Arts, therefore we didn't have anything, so basically the whole thing, collapsed. But for any projects that are going on now and fighting for those projects, I think it's absolutely brilliant to do that, and it is possible, and it was amazing, 3 years.
Hi, I'm Paul from the Southeast. Just a question for the panel. In terms of, emerging new platforms for people to perhaps express forms of art, such as YouTube or Vimeo, I just wondered the panel's thoughts on that, as to how some of those platforms might kind of circumvent and alter some of the traditional boundaries. Because, yes, you do need a smartphone, but as long as you have some kind of device that has a camera, and I appreciate not everybody necessarily has access to that, but you could produce something, so which would be outside of perhaps some of the boundaries that we've talked about here, and some of the limitations there. So would really appreciate the panel's thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, my voice is really gone, so sorry if it sounds like I'm dying. I am. I know it was a while ago now, but I put my hand up a while ago when the comedians in the back, particularly when Chaz was talking about a university experience and everything, I just want to say that I really related to that. I've got an education in fashion, and I don't want to go into the industry anymore, but you can't get into the industry if you don't have money anyway. You have to work for free for a month in London. I don't know anyone that's gone to the industry without doing an internship, and those internships, not only you have to look good as well. If you don't have good clothes, and if you're not presentable, if you don't have a very, if the way that you socialize isn't like that, then they're not going to want you there anyway. But you have to also work for free. So yeah, that really annoyed me, and I think that means a lot of the fashion industry is very shallow, and I think that is because the only people that we can have that are producing media in fashion is people that don't really have much to say. They're just there because it's fun and they have the opportunity to. And I also was just thinking about when I was on a school strike and I was talking to a young Tory, and he was talking about the markets and socialism and everything, and he said it wouldn't work because, you know, we need market incentives for innovation. And I just think, you know, if you really think about the greatest things that's happened in the 20th century, and, you know, even now still, obviously, all of the great culture that we produce comes from the grassroots sort of culture. And I just thought that it was so funny. He was very middle class, and I was like, you really are alienated from culture, aren't you? You really don't know what real fun culture is if you think that everyone is doing things for profit. The music and everything that everyone makes, we don't make any fucking money from it anyway. So we're definitely not doing it for profit. We're doing it because we love it, and it's the human experience. So yeah.
I work in an arts university, and it is posh. It is seriously posh, and London, you know, the fashion school part of it. Oh my God! The neoliberal institutions come in. Notre Dame burnt down. 200 billion euros just signed, just like that. They've come into the universities. They say, we want this lecture hall named after us. Check signed. New building, check signed. It is, you know, you go through every room and it's named after a fashion house or anything like that. And so neoliberalism has taken over big time. And Paul Gilroy said, neoliberalism is doing really well by not having history. And that's the thing about the postmodernist, post-structuralism, that is infested arts universities across the UK. One of the things that, you know, I notice, you have on one level, if you go to Imperial College London, you'll see a semblance of ordinary people, black people, Asian people, even professor level. You'll see them because they are probably the best in terms of research around the world. 300 meters down the road is the Royal College of Music. And I don't think they've put a new piece of music on any of their students' courses, you know, for the last 50 years. You know, and it is nothing innovative, nothing that comes out of it in terms of that. So the access that people have, even if you get there, it is, you know, really busted out of you in terms of kind of innovation or anything of that sort. You think I'm painting a grim picture. It is a grim picture, and one of the things that they have realized is that some of the working class students, black students who come into universities with good grades, leave with even worse grades than their white counterparts. And that's happening across all the UK university, but in the art colleges, it is shocking. It is absolutely shocking. There's no reference to their identity, no reference to any of their cultural stuff. I mean, you know, I teach on a MA on a culture, curation, criticism, and I say, do you know, I think classical music is important, but shall we shift gear in terms of London and in terms of what is taking place in London in terms of culture? Then look at you, you know, like as if you're a weirdo. You know, to say somehow that these things need to happen. The rot is there. The rot has happened since the 80s. And one of the things that shifted in the early 80s, and I suppose Haas is probably a product of that, was the Brixton riots. Because the Lord Scarman report said, we need to put money into a cultural revolution for the young black kids. We need a cultural revolution in curriculum. And immediately, local authorities put 3%, 4%, 5% of the budgets that and that's what Livingston came out with. That is what really kick-started the 80s cultural revolution. But it didn't take long. By 87, when the cuts started coming in and post-structuralism came in and postmodernism came in and said, we don't need a history. So that is the consequence. We not only we need to fight on finance, but actually a political level of what our history is.
I would like to thank everybody for a fantastic discussion. We've covered a lot of ground there, and I'm really sorry that not everybody got to speak who put their hand up. But you can carry on talking about this afterwards. I'm going to bring the speakers back in now to sum up and address the issues that you've raised. So who wants to go first? Okay, Nick Mahoney.
Yeah, very briefly, it's been a really interesting and rich discussion. I just suppose I wanted to say the movement Cultural Democracy is trying to talk about these issues, discuss them and campaign on them and formulate, grassroots campaigns. So anybody who wants to get involved, please do. And we're trying to do exactly that sort of thing, create that space for these sort of more wide-ranging discussions about culture. And I think that the 2 points I wanted to end on is about, I think the point actually is probably 3. The neoliberal cultural point, I think that's fantastically important that it tries to place itself or sell itself as ahistorical. But more than that, I think that something in relationship between neoliberal politics and neoliberal culture, and thinking about its culture. Culture's at the vanguard of neoliberal politics, if you like. The way the art industry and cultural industries work, the way that gentrification works through culture, all these, and I think that although neoliberal economics is getting rightly getting a very hard time now, but the neoliberal culture, I think, is getting less of a hard time. And I think we have to think much more about what it is about neoliberal culture that it seems so bulletproof, and how neoliberal culture works through culture to make its constant advances into different aspects of our lives. So there's 2 aspects of that I think that we've been thinking about. People that I've been talking to as part of this Movement of Cultural Democracy project. One is one of it is what we've just touched on already, politics of culture. So that's about access to the means of cultural production. So and access to the means of cultural production is obviously, as you said, space to talk and to get together and think. Obviously there's class, race, decolonisation. That's another massive issue about hierarchies in culture. Campaigning on funding and devolving funding, democratising the funding system, and rebuilding our cultural infrastructure so it's more accessible. Obviously we've got youth centres and all that sort of thing is gone. Libraries gone. Online culture, it's accessible. People do make amazing music in their bedrooms and send it around the world and work together online and stuff like that. But in terms of getting together and accessing infrastructure together face to face, it's much more difficult now. So the politics of culture and who accesses culture and how, and funding and space and all of that, these are political issues. They're not just cultural issues, but there's a. And the second issue is around cultures of politics, and I think this is very much related to the first one, politics of culture. So Raymond Williams talks about the tragic consequences of capitalism and how they basically culturally bear down on us as individuals every day, and so we're all a result of those tragic consequences, if you like. Culturally, we live our lives through capitalist culture, and that's at an individual level. We need to, psychologically, it's right through our being. So we need those spaces to talk about that, how that can lead to precarious living conditions, depression, whatever it is, and relate that to big public issues of our time. So that's not just about that's culture on the. Yep, and then obviously how we work and think and act as collectives. These are cultural issues. How we work as politically together, and then the institutional cultures we all live with and in and through. So we need to think about those tragic consequences together through participatory processes. We need to think about how we expand our democratic processes culturally. We need to collectively generate and creatively generate alternatives to the dominant cultures of politics, which are still fixated on electoral politics, which obviously is culturally is massively insufficient. So that's why the movement of cultural democracy is quite broad-ranging in its discussions, because there's all these things are cultural and they all need to be discussed and worked on. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great discussion, and I can't pick up every point, but just a couple of things. First thing is libraries. I agree. Libraries, when I was a kid, I had a branch library just over the road from me, and I spent hours and hours and hours in there, and that was the beginning of my career. And to be honest, libraries are probably the most egalitarian cultural space that we have, to be honest. And the fact that they're being shut down kind of tells you something. Do you know what I mean? And the most well used, and the places where working class people could go and not worry about they're going to be sneered at. I'll be told to shh once in a while, but that's about it. That's kind of a model, and that it's been taken away from us. We shouldn't underestimate. And that's why people with working class communities fought so hard to keep their libraries open, because we understand as working class people how important culture and access to arts, reading, learning, and so on and so forth is. So I agree absolutely entirely with you. I think the question of the Edinburgh Festival is very interesting. I talked to a working class woman who's got a small theatre company in Bradford last week, and she told me she saved up thousands of pounds to take a little show to the Edinburgh Festival. She actually got some very, very good reviews from the papers. It was obviously a good show. She got no pickup afterwards from any venues anywhere in the country. In other words, she thought she'd go to Edinburgh, pay to get that platform, and that she'd get picked up with bookings and an agent and all this kind of thing. Nothing. And then she saw her other plays, which were, to be honest, sounded, as you know, there's lots of mediocre stuff that happens at Edinburgh Festival. And because they were the zeitgeist or whatever it might be, they pushed all the right buttons, and they were the right people, and they knew the right people. They got all the bookings. Their careers went up, and so on and so forth. So that was a very obvious example, to me, of structural discrimination in terms of working class people. In terms of disability and access and those issues, I mean, to be honest, the arts is shamefully is a shameful barrier to disabled people in the arts. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary, and no one should ever think that inequality is just something that you live with. You know, inequality should not be lived with. It should always be fought against, and it's kind of something that burns in you. I'll give you an example. My oldest son, he's a wheelchair user, and he went to London University to do a BA in theatre directing. And to be honest, he was pretty good, because he's my son, right? But he was good, right? Now the interesting thing was, actually, all his cohort, about 15 others, all very middle class, have all gone on to get wonderful careers in directing. He's got nothing out of it, to be honest. And not only that, this will tell you, when he was at the University of the Arts, they had a library, and of course he had to access books in the library. But because the library wasn't accessible, right, he was banned from the library. And he was told what you have to do is you have to order the books in advance, and we'll bring them out to the steps for you. So and give them to you. And what he used to do, because he's a bolshy bugger, he used to ramp his wheelchair up into the library, and he used to be chased around by the librarian around the library. He's just trying to get him out. While he was going down the bookshelves trying to find a book he wanted. I mean, good for him. But I'm talking about 4 years ago, right? I'm not talking about ancient history. Yeah. And that, to be honest, is just a little example. And to be honest, for me, he was a brilliant theatre director, so it's such a shame that he's not been able to pursue that. And in one sense, access is access to be able to have freedom of speech and freedom of creativity. And what you have to say from your particular perspective is something that people need to hear. That's the most important thing to me. It's art is the most important thing. And I'll sum up with this. Grime. Think about it, right? Where does artistic innovation come from? It doesn't come from the conservatoires. It doesn't actually come from the universities. Artistic innovation, historically, you look at it, right, has always come from the margins. So you think about the most revolutionary development in popular music in this country, grime, and it has been grime that came from young kids from north, south, west, east London, who used to, after school, when down at the getting their chicken and chips, used to basically have competitions with one another, put it on YouTube, and then someone from another part of London would reply to that. And that's the roots of Stormzy and Wiley and all those kind of people, right? Now it's headlining at Glastonbury, but it was the most marginalised group of young people who told that they were worth nothing that has actually revolutionised popular music in this country. And I can tell you, drill. And if you remember, grime, right, used to be banned from every venue in London. All those venues are now picking up money out of putting on grime shows, right? Wouldn't have them in the building and their supporters in the building at all. And the Metropolitan Police put a ban, basically, of grime gigs all through London for a number of years. And in one sense, it did them good. because in one perverse sense, because they weren't incorporated into the music business. They kind of grew outside of it, and they found their own avenues and routes to distribute their music. I think the next big platform will be VR. I think that's the next thing that actually a lot of working class kids will begin to work in the medium of VR. I think that will be the next cultural or artistic revolution. But at the end of the day, with neoliberalism, the effect of it has been is that we have a proliferation of small stories, when in actual fact we need some grand narratives. The grand narratives are being lost that can piece the world together and make sense of it. The small narratives, I go to theatre all the time, it's just full of tiny, tiny individualistic narratives, and kind of identity politics has kind of fed into that. And actually, that does not explain the world. To explain the world, you need a particular vision, you need a collective narrative, you need to know your history, and so on and so forth. That's what's missing. But actually, that's what the working class can give to the arts, is a new relevance in terms of transforming the world.